look, the other thing that I'm reminded of with this is because I assume there's lots of foreigners looking at this, I need to explain a little bit about the culture of Australia in the early to mid 1960s. And I've got this little thing that I've written down there. It's got 4 C's, an M and a B. So the 4 C's are the conservative nature of Australian society. We've had a conservative government in Australia since 1959. There had been radical social changes in the immediate post-war period. In 1959, Bob Menzies gets elected Prime Minister with what is called a Liberal government, but in fact is a conservative government. So we have a very conservative British kind of culture. We also have in Victoria a conservative government, which is even more conservative than the National Conservative government. The Chief Minister, Ryler, had a teenage daughter, and if anything he thought would offend his daughter was put out there, then the police would come and swoop it up. So that this goes into the next thing, which is censorship. Now, we forget about censorship, but I've published, and if you go to Paul Flew, you will go to, you're right there. Robert needs, yeah, you will find that I published a fanzine, which I've accidentally published a couple of articles that have got to do with this. One is an item written by Dick Jensen, who went to America. It's about censorship. In Australia, censorship was severe. Any movie that had anything that might have offended Ryler's teenage daughter was sliced out. Anything that was politically contentious, sexual, was sliced out. There was probably not many movies that weren't edited for showing in Australia. At the same time, pornography or socially disruptive material was banned in Australia. So when Dick Jensen went to America, he discovered pornography in Chicago. He saw movies with bits in them that people in Australia would not see. Actually, what happened was Dick sent some of this pornography to John Foyster. Somehow the customs must have opened one and found out what was in it, so that Foyster got raided, and many of the books that Dick had sent him were confiscated. So censorship is a big thing in Australia. And later in the 1960s and 1970s, some members of the Melbourne Science Fiction Club took to standing outside theatres protesting about censorship. What was the third one? Oh, hold on, I've written it down. So, conscription, of course. The conscription in Australia was run differently because of the Vietnam War. Conscription in Australia was run differently to the United States. Conscription in Australia was run on a birthday basis. They figured out how many they wanted to conscript. They had a big barrel full of balls with dates on them, and they just pulled out as many balls as they needed. For
every 6 months, I think that was, wasn't it?
Yeah, that's right. Yeah. Now, I certainly got a little card saying I'd been indefinitely deferred. And I don't think that any of the active fans in Australia got conscripted, but it was certainly a big thing, and the moratoriums and the rallies that were going on were certainly a big thing in the late 60s, early 70s. The other important one that people outside Australia won't get is the cultural cringe. If it was British, it was better. If it was American, it was all right, but it was a bit racy. It was a little bit, yeah, nice, naughty but nice. Anything that came from Australia was second rate. We just didn't know how to do things properly. It was all inferior. And this cultural cringe affected everything going on in Australian life. It started to lift in the second half of the 1960s, which comes to the first of my other things, which is, hold on, if I don't know all four, cultural cringe, yeah, cultural cringe, right, which is migration. Now, actually, if you come to Australia today, it's nothing like Australia was in the 1960s, because it was still white Australia. If you were coloured or you were Asian, you weren't allowed to well, you could visit Australia as long as they knew where they were, so they could throw you out. Coloured people and Asian people weren't allowed. But what was happening was, after the war, the Australian government decided they needed to build up Australian population, 7 million at the end of the war. So they started importing people from overseas. Initially, they wanted POMs, British people. not enough British people wanted to come to Australia. I can't imagine why. Where else would you live? So they started importing, migrating people from Southern Europe, Greeks and Italians in particular, from about 52, 53. Endless boats full of migrants are coming to Australia. These boats are empty. What are we going to do? Well, there's two things. First of all, there's a bunch of young Australians who are constrained by this conservative culture in Australia and want to get out. They want to see the real movies. They want to read the real books. They want to go see real culture. So these boats are being backfilled by young Australians going to Europe, mainly to London. And in fact, until the B that I'll come to, if you didn't go overseas, you know, this is the culture of cringe in action. You had to go overseas to experience real culture. The other thing that happened was, and I'm shorthanding here by just saying the Beatles, but the Beatles implies a whole cultural revolution. I mean, if you remember when you first heard it, I was looking at this morning, Beatles performing in Melbourne in 1964. Now, they were on for 20 minutes. They played standard Beatles songs, you know them all. And it's all very, I mean, to educate myself, I watched the Taylor Swift concert. Goes for 3 hours. It's a fabulous, I mean, it was boring as hell, but it was a fabulous production. The Beatles came here, they performed for 20 minutes, they sang 6 songs, they just stood on a stage. But the screaming was amazing. But what's interesting is you look at what the people in the audience are dressed in, and they're all dressed in conservative, unimaginative clothing. There's a different culture in Australia before the Beatles arrive. But what they bring with them is this new youth culture. And so there is, I think, a boundary between someone like me and someone like Robin. And it's only a boundary of about 10 years. Also a boundary between me and Harding and Foyster and Bankson is because I remember when I've got this cultural, I don't know, feeling that begins with the Beatles and opens up into what injury in the blockheads, sex and drugs and rock and roll, so that these things, which were forbidden, well, actually still forbidden, but they became available in Australia, so that I never felt the need to go to Britain because I understood or felt that things were happening in Australia. There's a film industry begins in Australia. There's a rock and roll scene comes in Australia. You can go and see the Easy Beats or the Purple Hearts or the Coloured Balls. You can go to Festival Hall and see all kinds of things. You can go to, I forget the name of the disco in Spring Street, where things are happening so that culture in Australia starts to come alive. Now, this also affects science fiction fandom, so that at that 68 conference, the staff room at the McGill staff room, which is a low level down from the Melbourne Science Fiction Club, we got the keys to that, and Foyster called it the Star Pit. Well, there was interesting smells came out of that room that might not have come out of that room, very interesting, that might not have come out of that room earlier. And at 68, I didn't understand this at the time. I was talking to Kevin Dillon, and he said, "You're so lucky. In the 1950s, all we had was speed." I didn't, it's so the world is opening up, and all these things are combining to make an Australian culture which actually thinks that we might hold a World Science Fiction Convention. If you'd said that to the Futurians in the 50s, no, we're not good enough to hold a World Science Fiction Convention. At the beginning of the 60s, at the end of the 60s, we're thinking, maybe we are good enough, maybe we can.
Well, there was also the changes happening politically in the federal and state spheres. You had, well, from my home state, Don Dunstan coming in South Australia. And then, of course, the big major change was in 1972 when the Conservative governments were thrown out after 23 years. And we had the first post-war Labor government of Gough Whitlam. And then everything changed.
Everything changed. Let's move on. I might actually have that slide. If we have the next slide, I think I popped in a political slide just to point to this point that things change. Well, when did Dunstan come in? Must have been a couple of years.
69, 70.
69. So if we can go on to
Yeah,
the
so
next one.
he was in a year or two before
Yeah,
before Whitlam.
yeah,
Anyway,
right. We'll come back to that in a minute. The other thing, in terms of running for Worldcons, we realized had to change the Australian infrastructure. Got to actually learn to run conventions in hotels. So the first hotel convention was run at the Savoy Plaza in Easter, I think it was 1972. And I've just got one of the panels. This would be about science fiction because we've got Merv from the left, Merv, Leigh, Ron Smith, John Foyster, and Ron Graham. But they're at a table in a hotel. Next picture, please. The other thing that's going on is that Paul Stevens, this fanny side, Paul Stevens runs a thing called the Paul Stevens Show, which became a feature of conventions, which was basically a series of comic skits. This is John Foyster, me, and Velma Brown's. Velma's first convention. She was an actor by trade. So as soon as there's a script in front of her, away she goes. And that was her introduction to fandom, and she never looked back from there. But this is also made possible, in fact, the best Paul Stevens show ever, and I don't know where it's available, was at the convention, the Aussiecon, where John Bankson gave a little talk which was based on the sounds of the runoffs on long playing records, which he called ectrachiosomes. And so he talked with illustrations. So he gave his talk and he had illustrations and the runoff of ectrachiosomes. And he found different sounding ectrachiosomes to go with various trends in classical music. Anyhow, back to this. Distracted again. Yeah, Humphrey. That's right. His name was Humphrey Tape. So there's this fanny side to comes out of conventions. So this is the first convention. Hotel convention run in Australia, 72, because we have to learn to run them if we're going to run a Worldcon. Onwards.
We're only 3 years away from running the big
That's
one.
right.
Yeah.
Yeah. So this comes to Gough Whitlam. And with the change to a Labor government, but it's not just the Labor government has been sitting on change for 23 years, wants change. And so it introduced a whole series of radical changes very quickly. The government only lasts 3 years because there's no idea how to manage the changes. They come in, inflation comes in, but a whole series of changes. If I've got it right, Robin, some of the money for Aussiecon came from the Labor government. Yeah. The other thing that happened, referring back to the second picture I showed you, is that Race Matthews had gaffiated to join the Labor Party, and Race was elected to that federal government in 1952.
72.
He was in the federal government for 72 to 75.
Yeah.
He had been before that Gough Whitlam. Gough Whitlam's the Prime Minister in 72. He had before that been Whitlam's private PPS, personal private secretary. He told me that if this, it all ended badly because of mismanagement. If they'd actually won the 75 election, then Race would have been one of Whitlam's ministers, but he didn't. Race then went on to state politics and was the minister for police, the minister for that, the minister for that for many years. Race also opened Aussiecon. Anyhow, that Whitlam changed the whole atmosphere. The Labor government and Whitlam changed the whole atmosphere of Australia, especially for young people. Things were now possible that hadn't been possible before. Didn't lift the restriction on drugs, unfortunately, but certainly it encouraged a lot of what we called at that stage the new nationalism. There'd been a nationalist trend in Australia in the before the First World War, which had been killed by the war. But there's an emerging sense that being Australian is actually a good thing, that Australians can do things that other people can't do, or we can do things they can do, but we can do them in an Australian way. And I think we began to feel this in fandom in Australia, that we could do it our way, and that, if you're an American or a POM, well, that's fine, but we'll do it the way we think we want to do it. Onwards. Okay, now one of the things, we had to put publicity in the progress reports of conventions to say that we're here. And one of the things that came out of this was Gerald Carr, who's a comic artist in Melbourne, for LACon 2, put in each of the progress reports a continuing comic strip called Aussie Fan, which had as its evil nemesis Anti-Fan. And so this appeared in the 4 PRs and in the and I think they're all together in the program book. But out of that grew the idea of a movie if we go to the next one. So so John Litchin, who probably isn't in this, decided that they would put together, I think Paul wrote the script for this, made a movie called Aussie Fan that would be
Anti-Fan.
circulated. No, Aussie Fan. It's called, I
Aussie
think it's
fan.
called,
Oh, okay.
I think it's called
Sorry.
Aussie Fan. Um,
Right.
and then Anti-Fan is the anti-hero that
Oh, okay.
Aussie Fan had to defeat. So as I remember it, the plot of the thing is that Anti-Fan tries to kill off Australian fans so that they can't run a Worldcon. And it's Aussie Fan's job to prevent this from happening. So there's a series of cuts in which I get killed, David Grigg, Robin gets killed, but
Foyster gets crushed.
Oh, that's what pulps fall on him. There's a whole, anyhow, if you haven't seen it, I think it's on YouTube. So we made this movie. So got a little of this is actually taken out. No, it's not taken outside. It's taken in Swanson Street near Space Age. So there's Velma, who had a small part in it. There's Malcolm Hunt, who's Aussie Fan. There's Paul, Elaine Cochrane, who's now Bruce's wife. There's Paul Stevens dressed as Anti-Fan. I think that's John Breeden behind him, and I don't know who the other person is. So this is taken during the making of the movie, which we're going to send to the United States to go around the conventions to promote the idea of an Australian Worldcon. If we move on. So the next big thing was the second Sydney convention, SynCon 72, at which there are lots of Melbourne fans. So this is from the left, Shane McCormick, Lee Harding, Carla Harding, John Bankston, and Bob Smith. This is about as high as costuming got in Australia around about this time. And so because it's being run by Sydney fans and actually run a very good convention, the only one who would have been involved would have been Bob Smith. Next one, please, which is actually about one of the other things we had to do. We had never, apart from Robin, we'd never met an American fan. So Foyster thinks this idea of a fan fund like TAFF, which we'll call the Down Under Fan Fund. And so there's a race contest, and because Leslie Luttrell's in APA 45, I'm in APA 45. I'm publishing lots of fanzine. Leslie gets to win DUFF in 1972, comes to Australia. She's an American. We've never met Americans. It's amazing. So here's Leslie with Lee Harding and Bruce Gillespie. They're holding Ditmars, not called Dicks, they're called Ditmars. And Leslie went to Melbourne, she went, I think, might have met at SynCon, and then went down to Canberra in David Grigg's tiny car, how we ever did this, and then drove down to Melbourne and did the things that you do on fan funds. And this is the beginning of that tradition, which is, I suppose, still going. Next one, please. This tells you how big Australian conventions were. This is SynCon 72.
Leslie's on.
Hmm?
Leslie says, I'm happy to have proved American fans are nothing to be afraid of.
Very pleasant. Now, if I had a pointer, I could point out a lot of these people. If we sort of work out...
Front and centre is Bert Chandler.
Yeah, Bert Chandler sitting next to Ron Graham. If you start sort of from the right-hand side, and I'll do as many as I can, there's David Grigg sitting behind him next to a door is Kerry Hanfield. Then there's me. We move across, there's John Bankston, who's sucking on his thumb. Behind him is Merv. Moving across a couple is Paul Stevens.
Is that Eric Lindsay? Just a little bit
Yeah,
to
Eric
the...
Lindsay's. Yeah,
Eric Lindsay's there. Bill Wright at the back.
Yeah, coming down to the bottom left-hand side is Gary Hoff, and behind him is Ron Clark and Sue Clark. I think Alan Sandico may be next to him. There's also John Alderson in there. So one of these days we'll have to get together and work out who they all are.
Who
But
everybody is.
yeah, that's the size of an Australian convention in 1972. If we go on to the next one, you'll see that there's a bit of an improvement. Oh, yeah. So this is the 1973 convention, which is a bit bigger again. Melbourne fans had discovered the Victoria Hotel, site of many happy conventions. As I tell people, it's the convention which I said to Perry something, and he said, "What are you drinking?" And I don't remember the rest of the convention. But the core of people is starting to grow. And so this convention at the Victoria has got the Circon side, but if we go to the next slide, it's also got the Fanny side incorporated, so that many months in advance, I'm told that I wrote the script for Joe Faust. I have no memory of it. We put on a fan opera called Joe Faust, which is, of course, a Finnish version of Faust. I don't know who the person on the left is, but you'll see Michael Creaney in the blue jumper, Paul Stevens, John Foyster holding Valma, and there's me over there as well. You know, with music, singing, dancing, the whole works. We had the Sugar Club Plum Fairies were. No, I'd have to find the script. So we're oh, this is where by this stage John Bankson had moved to Canberra. I think one of the reasons he moved to Canberra was because it meant that he didn't have to be the centre of fandom in Melbourne, that we'd actually leave him alone. And a couple of guys who interviewed for Histories took jobs somewhere else just to get out of the social life they were in. John Bankson had moved to Canberra, couldn't come to this convention, but he wrote the Australian national anthem sung to the tune of the National which, well, those of us who are old enough remember strongly, but it was Australian fandom was building up its own ethos, its own traditions in a way that American and British fandom had by doing our own things in our own particular ways. So anyhow, Joe Faust was maybe the culmination of that, because then we did get involved in running a Worldcon. Next one. Ah, yes, alcohol. This is actually the convention in 1975. The only picture of John Alderson I could find, and there he is with his bottles of wine, which I warn you against. Haven't seen him for 30, 40 years, but we still remember his wine. Alcohol played a very large part, as it has in British fandom, I know, with the organisation of things. Certainly at De Grave's Tavern, Henry's wine was and it came in, I don't know, 40-litre plastic casks that you paid money for. But it was red and alcohol in them. What more could you want? The other thing that, and really these slides have passed out, passed over, is the fact that we organised ourselves, our conventions, to learn how to run conventions. We produced the Aussiecon film. We advertised in all the Worldcon program books. We started going to World conventions so that Bill Wright went with you, didn't he, to the...
72.
Yeah. Did Foyster go to 72? No, he wouldn't have. Because he wasn't talking to Americans by then. John Foyster was an extremely principled person, and he cut contacts with American fandom after the Americans mined
Bond Hanoi.
Yeah, that's right. Yeah, as soon as that
Yeah.
happened, he resigned from SAPS. He refused to have anything to do with Americans. He'd sort of come okay. Well, 70 Aussiecon was after the end of the Vietnam War.
Yeah.
Interesting sideline. So that a few Australian fans went to LACon too. In fact, Bill Wright and Robin Well both.
Barry just mentioned that he met both of us there.
Yeah, he would. If you ask Robin these days, apparently they had a con suite next to the swimming pool, and they showed the Aussie fan film more or less non-stop. And people from the swimming pool would come in and lie on their beds and drip all over their beds while they watched the Aussie fan film. And it just went on endlessly through the convention promoting it. After that, Jack Chalker and someone else took copies of the Aussie fan film and showed it at every convention they could go to for the next year or two, to promote this idea of Australia in 75.
Chalker went to a lot of conventions.
Yeah, there was another fellow whose name I've now forgotten, who also said, so we're promoting this thing in the bid for the...
Finland? Hmm.
No, it wasn't Findler, it's someone else. I don't think it was. Might have been him. So that in 1973, a bunch of Australian fans went to the Worldcon in Toronto, Talkon 2, to bid for the convention, and apparently it was a walkover because we just worked so hard at promoting this thing. So we've got this Worldcon. We've now got some experience in going to Worldcons. We've got ourselves a bit organised. Now we've got to run the bloody thing. As Perry, it looks like that because you ran two of them, or 1.5. And Robin looks like he does. I won't show you a picture of him because he ran one.
Well, I'm on your screen labelled Leigh and I'm blacked out.
All right, well, that's probably just as well. So we now spend from 73 through to 1975 getting ourselves organised to do this thing. Let's go on to the next slide. I'm not quite sure I am up to with the next slide. All right, so we're actually going to talk about Aussiecon. And Robin can tell you more about this when you interview him. In fact, I'll be in on that because I want to do the questions. One of the Ursula Le Guin was going to be the guest of honour, and one of the conditions she put on coming was there would be a writers' workshop. Now this fits, which Robin and Bruce then had to organise. But the point is that it's actually sort of the direction in which science fiction in Australia is going, because Leigh Harding at this stage has managed to convince Australian publishers, and he's also sold a couple of books overseas, so that there's beginning to be a science fiction writing community in Australia as well as a Finnish community. At the 1974 convention, Leigh ran a one-day's writers' workshop at which people like David Grigg and several other people whose name went away, they had stories, they went away and discussed them. So this ability, this need to actually try and write Australian science fiction is also being fed at the same time. But the promise of Ursula Le Guin running a science fiction event, a workshop, boosted the potential for this, boosted the interest in science fiction in Australia. What's also happening is that Bruce, Rob Durand, and Kerry Hadfield, launched North Australia Press. It's actually based initially on the collections of writings that Bruce had done about Philip Dick, but he expanded from there to include other things, so that the stories that were written at the Le Guin workshop were edited by Leigh Harding and published by North Australia Press. The North Australia Press went on to do quite a bit of publishing before they ran out of steam. Just on the side, North Australia Press, Rob has revived North Australia Press, which will be publishing the first half of my history, called Proud and Lonely, which we hope to launch in May. Anyhow, so we come to Aussiecon. We've done all the preparations, and Robin has organised a plane load of people. The other thing I should say about this, which comes out of my interest in aviation history, the Aussiecon would not have been possible if it hadn't been for the invention of the Boeing. Well, it would have been very difficult if it hadn't been for the invention of the Boeing 747. Well, the 707, but then the 740 in particular. Did they come out on 707s or?
Well, it would have been a DC-10.
It would have been, anyhow, the next generation of airliners, which actually made airfares cheaper, because getting to Australia was even so not cheap. Anyhow, so we've got to run this World Convention. So it's at the Southern Cross Hotel, which, just as an aside, is built on the site of the old Franklin's Library, which is where Leigh Harding and Dick Jensen borrowed their pulp science fiction from in the 1950s. So there's a link between the site, between 1953 and 1975. All these things come together. We spent 5-7 years thinking about this, and there it is. It's whatever the dates are. This thing's going to happen. Americans arrive. Le Guin arrives, Tucker arrives, Rusty Heblin arrives, an aeroplane with Susan Wood, John Berry arrive. And it's all a bit bit overwhelming. Once again, I'm sure Robin couldn't tell you much about it. I can't tell you much about it. One of the
Neil
interesting,
Rest may be the person.
well, what I was just going to mention was the Wang girls. The Bill writes through his connections, because remember, this is 1975, computers are new. There's a mob producing computers called Wang. Bill happens to know them, the boss of Wang, through I don't know what, and I'm not asking. And so Wang decides to install computers at in the convention, which is running I think it's a Star Wars game, some kind of science fiction game. And so you
Lunar
can go.
Lander, wasn't it? Was it Lunar Lander?
No, I don't think.
He was shooting.
It was shooting at something.
Oh, okay. All right.
Couldn't be Lunar Lander. All right, this is on the side again. I got invited to be guest of honor at the second or third SwanCon, and we went over there, and I met Roy Ferguson, who was running the computer at UWA. And so he said, "Oh, let's play Lunar Lander." So Valma and I played Lunar Lander, not realizing that we were using 3/4 of UWA's computer capacity to do it. Backwards to 1975. So we've got the computers, but no one knows about computers. So Wang hires a bunch of girls who are taught how to teach people to run these computers. Don't know where Wang got these girls from, but they actually had had a list up there. If you want to play with a computer, you put your name on a list to be taught how to run the computer. But the girls had another list where they offered other services, which I only found out about afterwards. So a lot of I suppose fringe fans had encounters, shall we say, at the convention. Anyhow, so we built up to this thing. Next slide. And so here we are. There's all these people. You'll see John Berry, will see himself there. There's Mike Glixon. Don't know the fellow at the left-hand end. Someone might identify him. What have we got? Him, Shane, John Berry, Michael Glixon, me, and I can't see the rest of them.
Oh, I think that with the sunglasses is probably Banks and probably
could be.
maybe Gillespie next to him. I'm not sure.
I don't know. Anyhow, that was the fan panel. There's also a pro panel. There's all kinds of. The other interesting thing is that, as far as I know, and this is Dashby's.
John Thompson.
Yeah.
Gary Kaufman suggested.
Right. As far as I know, this is the first convention to be videoed, which is Don Ashby's fault. Don Ashby, I'd forgotten. Around about the beginning of 1975, a little bit before, Robin Johnston and John Hamm, and I got this right, moved into a place in Carlton, and then things moved around, and by the middle of 1975, they called themselves a Magic Pudding Club, and it was a floating party that went on almost day and night. If you had nothing to do and you were in Carlton, you could go to the Magic Pudding Club. So that there's down in St Kilda where Valma and I are living, and a few other people are living, and up in Carlton, there's actually by this stage, there's two hubs. Bruce would have been up in the Carlton area as well. So there's two hubs of fandom in Melbourne that meet regularly at the Graves Tavern, produce fanzines, members of FanZapper, running a world convention. Anyhow, so we're back at the Worldcon. We're doing this next one. As well as DUFF, we ran a DUFF. Oh, I forgot to mention I won DUFF in 1974. Totally forgot that. I shouldn't have won. John Bankson was nominated. He would have won hands down, but he moved to Canberra, decided he wouldn't go with draws. So I went. If you go to Corflue, I've got a presentation of the pictures I took while I was in America. So go to Corflue. So Bob Tucker, there was a special fund to get Tucker to Aussiecon.
Known as the Tucker bag.
Oh yeah, and that exactly. And Tucker dominated the Fannish side of the convention. We all learned to drink a lot of bourbon. Actually, Tucker taught me to drink bourbon in Discon. Don't drink much else since then. So there was Tucker, and there was, next please.
Very smooth.
Yeah, and there was Ursula Le Guin. Now, the highlight of the convention for me, was Ursula Le Guin's speech. And in fact, when I get to finish the second part of the history, it finishes with Ursula Le Guin's speech, because it's about the evolution of science fiction, the growth of science fiction, not just in Australia, but around the world, and what she said at that speech. Now, at that convention, I ran the daily news sheet, and things were going on. I had someone come up to me and say, "Can you put an ad in for people who are running university clubs? Can we get together?" Because I knew there was a club at Monash University in Melbourne and Melbourne University in Melbourne. I didn't know there were university clubs in Sydney and other places.
Adelaide as well.
Adelaide. So they got together at Aussiecon, and they decided they were going to hold their own conventions. Trek media fans got together and decided they'd get together. A whole bunch of things. If you ask me what happened to Aussiecon, after Aussiecon, we go to the next slide. Boom, there you go. So much happened so
Exactly.
quick.
Yep.
Now, were you at Aussiecon? No, you weren't.
Yeah, I was there. That was
Yeah.
my first ever convention.
Yeah, so there's a whole bunch of people. The population, 600 or something.
700, I think, was the estimated attendance. Yeah.
Yeah. Of those,
I
quite a
think
few
if you,
hundred.
I think it's one of those things that if you ask Fandom who was there, I think if you were to count them all up, you'd probably get to a couple of thousand. But there were only 700 there.
Yeah. So, so what happened was that, as in 1966, when the first convention in 8 years or so happened, it caused a little critical mass. What happened at Aussiecon created not one, but a series of little critical masses that then went off and did other things again. The reason that my history will finish in 1975 is because trying to track it after that is just too difficult. And also, there was a lot. The thing that 1975 did was it gave all of Australian fandom a goal. We're all heading in this direction. We're all going to do this thing. But after 1975, we all decided we're going to do different things. And so fandom splinters a bit. And there are some feuds that I was involved with, which I don't want to write about, so I'm not going to, which is why we finished in 75. So anyhow, that's the end of the history. I have to tell you that this is actually, what you've seen now is the first draft of the second part of the history of Australian science fiction fandom. To do this, I've sat down and written pages and pages of notes working out how it will all go together, what the components will be. One of the important components which I think fan historians, amateurs, I'll give you that, miss out on is the social context of that science fiction and fandom lives in, which is why I talked about the 4 C's and the M and the B. If you don't understand those, you don't understand how fandom works in a cultural context.
Well, some of that things that we've covered here, like, for example, the change of government in 72, I think people overseas probably just don't understand what it was like in Australia in the 1960s, and then what it was like 72 to 75, and then post 1975. Things, as you say, the boom's there because things just exploded. Culturally, just things suddenly became available, and you could suddenly start doing things. And crikey, what's this Vietnamese food we're eating now? And all these different things that sort of changed everything, completely changed my life because that was the first convention I went to. And I think you'll probably find there's a couple of other people here on this listening in to this session as well, who were either there or were completely changed by Aussiecon and were still involved in fandom after all these after all this time.
Cool, I have gone on, haven't I? I'm
you
sorry
have gone
for
on, and I think we've probably covered just about everything that we possibly
I've
can.
got nothing more.
However, I know
Clarification.
that Edie wanted to open it up to questions, so I think what I should do is I should allow her to go to that. Wait, before we go, before we go to the questions, I'd really like to thank you for these 2 major speeches that you've been able to give regarding Australian SF fandom and its history. It's certainly filled in a lot of back information for me that I wasn't aware of, and it really gives you a sense of where it's all come from and where it's going to.
Perry, I just forgot. I was going to ask the people a question. The reason I'm going to Corfu isn't to go to Corfu, it's to go to UC Riverside the week after. There's a reason for this is because Australian fans were not producing fanzines of any, really, between, say, about 58 and up until, apart from Foyster and Baxter, not producing anything until 66, 68. But what I have discovered is they were writing, the Bob Smiths, the Chris Bennies, the whoever else, were writing to American fanzines. So to fill in this gap from late 50s through to the mid 60s, I'm going to have to go and trawl American fanzines to see if I can find the little snippets. For example, I've got a Lighthouse, Terry Carr Lighthouse. It's just a letter from John Foyster saying, things are changing here. I was walking down the street and I walked past Chris Benny and he didn't recognise me. Now, I read somewhere else that Chris Benny was probably writing a column for Cry of the Nameless at some stage. Anyhow, look, the question to you guys is to target what I'm looking at. What I would like to know is what were the focal point fanzines in America in that period that Australians might have been getting and contributing to letters or whatever. So all those people looking at me.
1958 to 1966,
50.
is that the period?
Yeah, thereabouts. Yeah. So, and I'll be asking the same question at Corfu. So anyhow, your questions, comments, whatever.
Right. So this is, Leigh, this is the first time anyone has asked the audience a question. So you've turned the tables successfully. All right, everyone, you know the drill. If you have questions, please put them in the chat and I'll call on you one by one. Or if you have any comments on the focal point fanzines from 1958 to 1966, put that in the chat too.
I have a pen, I have some paper.
I have a chat being automatically recorded, which will work also.
Right.
I think before we get to that, though, Leigh, we should really have a solid discussion, you and I and the gentleman to your left or right, in the same room as you, about discussing Aussiecon and its aftermath.
Yeah.
And
Look,
just doing a session, do a session just particularly about that, and see who else we can bring in.
I intended to interview Robin anyhow for the project, so let's do it together for FANAC.
Yeah,
You happy to do that, Robin? Yeah, Robin's happy.
Sounds
okay.
Sounds great.
Sometime later this year. You're going to Glasgow, aren't you?
Okay, we have a question from Rich Lynch.
Yep.
So,
Go for it.
Rich, please take yourself off of mute.
Working on it worked. Okay. You haven't said much about Brisbane fandom. There's 3 fairly well-known Australian fans: Frank Brining, Charles Mustian, Bill Veeney. What can you say about those guys?
They're 1950s. It's all in the book. I talked about, actually, if I didn't talk about it last time, it's because I ran out of time. There was a group formed, probably 52, 53. Frank Brining moved from somewhere to Brisbane and started to form a group. Now there's Charles Muskin, who's actually in Coolangatta, which is what, 2 hours drive south of, well, depends on which road you're on, Coolangatta, with a fabulous collection. Bill Veeney lived there for about a year at the most. He's a Sydney fan, very active before the war and after the war. There was a whole bunch, there was probably a dozen, maybe 15 fans. In the end, they ended up having monthly meetings in the home of John and Betty Taff in suburban Brisbane. Now, it's like there was a group in Brisbane at the same time, in Adelaide at the same time, exactly the same organisation. There's a woman who organises, because of the embargo and because science fiction is rare in Australia, forming libraries becomes very important, and clubs form around libraries. So that the Brisbane Club formed around the library, and they decided that since the library was in Betty Taft's house, they will meet in Betty Taft's house. The same thing happened in Adelaide with Joyce's house. She had the library. The meetings were monthly in Joyce's house. Now, I don't know what happened to either of these. Well, Bill Veeney moved back to Sydney.
Supposedly the BSFG was a group of collectors, or mostly, and
Yeah, they're
although it
collectors.
wasn't too active during the 60s, at the end of the 60s, a more active organization was found in
Yep.
the Brisbane Fantasy and Science Fiction Association because of a fellow named Dennis Stocks.
Yeah, Dennis and Del Stocks. I haven't been able to track them down. That Dennis was, in fact, produced a lot of very thick fanzines in a period. In fact, I went to a couple of QCons. He started, in fact, you're right, I'd forgotten QCons. So there's Sydney comes along first with its conventions, then there's Adelaide, and there's Queensland. A group, this is in this period, doesn't form in Hobart. There's an active fan, Michael O'Brien, in Hobart, who knows Don Tuck, and there's a couple other collectors in Hobart. The only other place that in Perth, there's no active fandom until well, active, excuse me, fandom in Perth's very interesting. It actually grows out of the Murdoch University Library, because there's Patricia Smith, I think it's Patricia Smith, who's going to do a thesis. So she gets the librarian, Grant Stone, to start collecting stuff. Grant Stone discovered fandom, never really becomes a fan, but he becomes very supportive of fandom, and he begins collecting fanzines. Until John Foyster's papers went to Murdoch, you'd say that the biggest fanzine collection in Australia was in Perth, because Grant Stone had collected it. And because I got on with Grant, my collection went there in the 80s. But fandom didn't, in fact, fandom in Perth grows out of Aussiecon as well. A couple of Perth fans are at Aussiecon. They get together with Grant. They organise a SwanCon in someone's, Anthony Pesey's house. And then they decide that they will hold conventions as well. I think SwanCons are probably one of the few conventions remaining in Australia. Fandom in Australia, like everywhere else, has changed significantly. Well, that's someone else's job. Anyhow, does that answer your question? Right.
Okay.
Well, it more than answers your question. Gone back to the history of fandom in the 50s. All be in the book.
Yeah, do we have any other questions that people would like to ask? There are a number of suggestions for focal point fanzines that you might look at when you get to Riverside, or you can look at them on Fanac, because we have a lot of them online.
Yeah, you've got them online. As a professional trawler, historian, it's much easier to go to the place and to look at the real thing than it is to trawl Fanac. And it's just because of the way that scanned magazines work. If I get out a copy of Lighthouse or something, I open it up, contents page, nothing, letter column on page, and it takes me half a minute to check to see whether a fanzine's got one.
Wounding us to the quick. That's why we're making them all searchable PDFs. But we'll talk at Corfu about that.
Exactly, yeah. Because I have, I should have said, for the first part of history, I trawled all the news zines I could find on Fanac. Thank you for, it would, what I've written would be a lot poorer without the little snippet of information I found on Fanac. But getting there was, well, history is hard work anyhow. Yeah.
There you go. A question from Nigel Rowe. Nigel, was
you? Nigel. Oh, yeah. Nigel,
hey, Leigh. Very nice to hear from you. Leigh, thank you so much for today's session. Very informative. But my question, you can probably imagine what it is, was about the lack of contact really between Australian fans and New Zealand fans through the years. I mean, my research is trying to build out that more information about that aspect, you know, because for the two fandoms at the bottom of the world, you know, Southern fandom, they had very little contact, you know, for the longest time. and I've been looking for letters in New Zealand fanzines from the 50s and the 60s to see if there's anything there that I could throw over to you, but I haven't really found anything. And it looks like New Zealand fans really were like focused further abroad, which I think, you know, because they had very substantial communications with fans in America
Yeah.
and England, and especially in the 50s and the early 60s. And only really through Aussiecon one, only 5 New Zealanders had even gone to Australia to meet local fans, really.
Yep.
But no, apart from Bertram Chandler, no Australian fans or authors had come across to New Zealand. Have you got? Have you thought about that anymore? I don't know if you've fleshed that out.
Look, I have, and let's share a bourbon at Corfu about this, because it seems to me that Australian fans, when the fandom is active and vital, are actually looking outside of themselves. And where are they looking? They're looking where the light is brightest, and the light is brightest in North America.
Yep.
So, sort of New Zealand, it's you'll find in part 1 of the history in the late 50s, if American fans thought about fandom down under, they thought about New Zealand. And I've got a quote from Rick Sneary writing about there's a fresh breeze blowing from the south, and he's talking about New Zealand, not Australia.
Well, that was because of
I-
the support for Southgate, I think. So
Yeah, and because see, this is Merv Barrett in particular, because I've got a couple of issues of Focus I picked up from somebody. I got the impression the last Focus was produced in Melbourne, I think.
it was.
Not sure.
Yeah, it was.
Yeah. But in fact, if Mervyn Barrett hadn't come to Melbourne, fandom in Australia would be quite different, because he's the catalyst.
Yeah,
that
he's a
brings-
focal point, wasn't he? Around
Yeah.
Melbourne. Yeah.
Yeah,
I
he's
mean, he
the
was
guy-
there for 5 years.
Yeah, he's the guy who brings together the Hardings, the Foysters, and all these other people. If he
And
hadn't
then it
had
was
those
Foyster
parties,
later,
they wouldn't have met. And so we wouldn't have what we've got now. So blame it all on Mervyn Barrett.
I have many times.
I know.
Many
We'll have a
times.
talk about this. I don't know whether New Zealand is the same way. You're also looking where the light is brightest.
Well, we totally were in the 50s. In the 60s,
Yeah.
everybody, like Mervyn, went to Australia en route to London, ended up staying in Melbourne for 5 years.
Yeah.
And then him and Bruce Burns like took up residence in London.
Yeah. Well,
you know,
see, they were
so-
doing exactly what a lot of us. There's in 1970, after SynCon 70, or before SynCon 70, a bunch of Sydney fans decided they were going to go to England. They got a double-decker bus, which they fitted out to drive all the way to London. Never got to London, but on board, the only person we know now is John Brosnan, who got there and then, of course, became well established in Britain in
Didn't
fandom
leave.
there.
Yeah.
And we do not know. See, John Baxter as well. John Baxter is now living in Paris. He was one of the cornerstones of Australian fandom for 5 years. He went to London, then to America, then to Paris. Harding and Foyster were both planning to go to London, but didn't. And I think they didn't because they got children and they weren't going to, take wives and children to London. So there was a whole generation of Australians who wanted to go. Some did, some didn't. And we don't know how many of the people who went could have contributed to fandom in Australia or fandom in New Zealand. Because to like we rob New Zealand, as we always do.
Yeah, and also just travel back then. I mean, your comment before about how the 747 changed everything. Before that, everyone had traveled by sea, like.
Yeah.
Yeah. We have another question from Kurt Phillips. Kurt, would you please unmute?
Hi, Leigh. Good
Yep.
to hear from you again. I'm really enjoying your presentation tonight.
Good.
You talked a bit about the first American fans who came to Australia. Well, who were some of the first Australian fans who began traveling outward to North America or Europe to meet other fans?
Well, quite honestly, it was all apart from Robin, who is a migrant to Australia.
100%.
Yeah, well, he was born in Tasmania, so that's almost as bad.
Steady.
If it hadn't been for Aussiecon, Australian fans may never have gone.
Was Kerry
because
Hanfield traveling in the early 70s? Because he did a
no,
lot of traveling overseas. It was after
yeah,
Aussiecon, was it?
yeah. Now, if it
Alright.
hadn't been for the fact that we had to have representation at LA-Con and at TourCon, and if it hadn't been for DUFF that took me and Valma and a few others to DISCON to promote the bid, may never have gone. Because look, even these, to get to San Francisco, I've got to sit in a rotten United 777 for 14 hours. Now, it's the amount it's costing me is not much in terms of money these days, but 14 hours strapped into the seat of a rotten Boeing airliner is something I am not looking, and then 14 hours on the way back again. Just the logistics of getting there is enough to put you off. And so I think that, well, certainly there wouldn't have been the people go to there wouldn't have been people going to LACon or TourCon if it hadn't been for that. What happened then was that some people hung around. You will get a copy of Ornithopter 2 in which Bruce Gillespie tells you what he did after TourCon. Secrets are revealed, etc. And yeah, look, it's the distance. The reason that the history is called Proud and Lonely, it's the lonely part that is the important word there.
The proud and lonely thing.
A proud and lonely thing to be a fan, but it's even lonelier to be an Australian fan or a New Zealand fan. Now, it's interesting question you raised, Nigel. We'll talk about this. Why is it, I talked about how Australian fandom grew because it amalgamated with comics fans and then got Trek fans. Now, fandom in New Zealand, Australia could have grown even more by linking, but maybe it's the Tasman Sea, because crossing the Tasman, how many hours? With
Getting on for 4.
getting on, but once again, it's also the cost. See, the other thing about Whitlam governments and those kinds of things is that, wow, a lot of inflation. The generation one, that Beetle generation, have got more disposable income of the generations before. For the aviation history, I've looked at how much it cost you to get between places. Now, before the war, Melbourne and Sydney fans never met. Why didn't they meet? Because it cost you almost a week's salary to get the train from Sydney to Melbourne. Who could afford that? Even after the war, only 2 or 3 Melbourne fans went to Sydney conventions because it was too expensive. Race Matthews went because he had more money than most. So Merv Binns went to one convention in Sydney, and Bob McCubbin went to one. And I think maybe only 3 fans got as far as Sydney because of the cost. I wrote a paper for a convention, a history conference, to explain to Americans the geography and the cost of living in Australia. That there are only 5 cities, so to speak. The rest is all the rural areas, which is where you really want to live anyhow. But before World War II, it took days it would take you a day to get between Sydney and Melbourne if you could afford to do it, which you couldn't. And so this distance between, and I hadn't thought about this, Nigel, this distance economically and also in terms of until Air New Zealand starts getting DC-10s or Qantas are getting 747s, you can't afford to fly across the Tasman even.
Yeah.
It's just too expensive. Now, why we didn't actually establish that fanzine and correspondence link that we wanted to establish with the Americans is a different question.
It's an odd one, isn't it?
Yeah.
Yeah.
I mean, New
It
Zealand
stands
had the
out. It
same.
stands
New
out.
Zealand had the same expenses. Fans traveling between cities was very rare until we started having conventions in the end of the 70s. I mean, New Zealand was 20 years behind Australia in having conventions and people
Yeah.
reliably and regularly meeting face to face. Just local fans, never alone
Yeah.
people from
I
overseas.
I recall one time I'm in the United States. See, when you're flying in Australia at night, you take off from a city. You then fly across darkness until about 10 minutes before you get to the next city. Then you see lights. And I flew from Seattle to Washington one time. And I take off from Seattle at night, look out, I go to sleep, look out the window. Oh, there's lights. We could be landing soon. We flew on for another 2 hours and there's nothing but lights. And you think, what a big, rich country the United States is, how relatively easy and expensive it is to get around in comparison to where I come from. And New Zealand's obviously got the same thing.
Yeah.
We have
Leigh, I'm sorry, you
go ahead,
mentioned
go ahead.
I'm sorry, you mentioned those 5 cities in Australia, but you haven't talked about Adelaide at all. Fandom in Adelaide. I know of a few fans there now, Damien and Nick Faulkner and folks like that. But who were the first fans to come out of Adelaide?
Well, there was a group before a group in 1950 which disappeared. There's a group at Adelaide University. Jeff Harris, Alexander Coe,
72, Alan Sandico,
Stokes,
McFarlane, Clark.
Well, you're an Adelaide person, you know them.
Yeah, that's from about 1972.
Oh yeah, had some nice times.
And so, but it was
Harry.
sorry.
It started off as the Adelaide Uni Science Association put out a science fiction weekend, which I missed, and that started off OSFA. So it's about
So when was that? 1971, 72?
71, I think, was the Science Association SF week.
Well, I was still at high school, so I didn't know anything about it at that point.
Yeah, no, they
and I went to Adelaide University in 1973, and it was running then. And the first person that I came across there was Alan Sandico.
Yeah, Mark there is also that Aussiecon was your first, wasn't it? Yeah.
Yep. So Mark and I come from completely the same era. And Roman Ozansky's around that time as well.
Yeah. Does that answer your question? There's a group in Adelaide grows out of a science club, Adelaide University, and then expands.
Alan Bray. I don't know Alan Bray's from Adelaide. I don't know his history, but he'd been around for a fair while when I turned up.
Alan Bray had been part of Mrs. Joyce's group.
He was, yeah.
Yeah.
Right, okay. So that was the 50s?
Yeah, he was in that group. But once again, I didn't know to ask him the questions. If I'd known to ask him the questions.
And he's now gone, so yeah.
Yeah, exactly. The trouble with all of us is we don't know the questions to ask when they're around.
Yep.
So we just have to piece them together. Anything else?
Yeah, we have one more question from Jerry Kaufman. Jerry, would you please unmute?
Show your face, Jerry, so I know what you look like.
I'm waving. We're going to see. Leigh is going to be here in a little over a week, I think.
I was appalled. I was I'll be there next week. Yeah, shocking, isn't it?
So let's see. The real question I want to ask is, what happened to Donald Tuck again? You started talking about him, and then you backtracked and added a whole bunch of political background and never returned.
Don Tuck, and once again, we'll talk to Robin about this in more detail. Don Tuck was the Australian fan guest of honour at Aussiecon. Didn't show up. I wasn't surprised because Don had become a collector and a bibliographer. Well, almost at the beginning of the 1950s. He wrote a couple of things for Leigh Harding fanzines. I think he kept in touch with Graham Stone, but he's of that generation which focused on collecting and bibliography. That was their idea of fandom. So Mike O'Brien, who we do know, used to go occasionally to Don Tuck's place where a couple of other old collectors would get together and talk about science fiction, but they never had any desire to form a club or to publish a fanzine. Only Mike did that. Don published 3 issues of Pro Fan in the 1940, and that's the most fanish he got. But he made his reputation as a bibliographer.
He published a major bibliography of SF, didn't he?
Yes, he got a couple of volumes, yeah.
Yeah,
Three
God,
three
he knows
volumes of
something.
science fiction encyclopedia. 3 volumes.
Yep. He started off wanting to know what was in his collection, so he evolved a way of cataloguing his own collection. Then he was talking to a fan in Perth, whose name I now forget. Roger Dard.
Maggie Thompson is trying to show us the Tuck books. Thank you.
Yeah, that's right. Yep, that's exactly what they look like. They were staple reading.
That's because
novels.
that's what they are.
Yeah. Merv used to refer to those all the time. So Don had started listing what he had, and then he was talking to Roger Dard, and Roger Dard said, "You should get a bit serious about this." So Tuck evolved ways of doing his bibliography. He got in touch with oh no, look, I don't have got too much stuff going in my head. I couldn't tell you the names of them, but Redbox might have been one of them. Fans.
Maggie's holding up.
Yeah, that's what it looks.
Yeah. Oh, okay.
That's
1 and 2. Who's
yeah.
2?
Were they?
Yep.
Were those published by Advent?
I think they were. I never
You
bought
can tell
them.
us for sure.
Yeah.
Yes, they were published by Advent and they're still in print.
Yeah,
Wow.
I can believe it. But you know, they finished at a certain stage, but he was ferocious.
Can you imagine how thick the current equivalent would be?
Yeah, well, it'd be impossible, wouldn't it? Oh, there we go. Yeah. No,
Hey,
Merv relied on those.
one of the
in
rare
modern-
unautographed copies.
Oh, yeah.
I'm joking. None
Yeah,
of them
yeah.
are autographed, I'm sure.
Yeah,
So Leigh and Perry, the question that I used to angle my way into this conversation was, did you or anybody in Australian fandom have any contacts with fans in China, Singapore, or other East and South Asian countries?
Fans in those places? Never heard of.
One.
There must have been. We know there
There's a
were.
guy-
Unless
the
they
name?
started a lot later, there were Japanese fans, and I know there was
Yeah.
at least one Singapore
No,
person.
there's a meeting which I've not mentioned because it's in an area I can't look any further. There was a meeting between. You have to turn the sound off, Robin. There was a meeting. We're right? No, we're not. It's just Robin's looking at it on another computer and he's got the sound on. You've still got the sound on, Robin. No, it hasn't turned the noise off. Hand it over, Robin will. Actually, just press the top one.
I was just trying to make sure we don't get any feedback. But no, from my perspective,
feedback.
I don't remember being in contact with any. I know there was one American fan that hasn't been mentioned yet who was posted to a US Army base in Western Australia. Can't remember his name, up in Esperance. That was in the early and mid 70s. After 1975, things may have changed, but we're talking about the period up until 1975 to Aussiecon. I don't recall any at all.
I vaguely remember that the Bijo Trimble had contacts because she and John brought Takeshi Shibano to a West Coast convention, maybe a Westercon.
Yeah.
Thank you. John Barry got the name right for me. Thank you.
I wasn't aware of anybody from Southeast Asia or anywhere in Asia visiting Australia for conventions.
Yeah, there was one Indian person whose name I can't remember who was more on the academic side. Can I also just point you back to cultural? Yeah, that's him. There was also the cultural thing. You've got to remember the White Australia policy. I think I mentioned the White Australia policy.
If you were not our colour, you weren't welcome.
Yeah, if you had slanty eyes, you weren't welcome.
You were not welcome. They did not want you in this country at all. Don't forget, up until 1968, we didn't even count our indigenous population as being human. They were part of flora and fauna.
Yeah. so that Australians simply don't. We're trained not to think about Asia. It's not there. It's just this hump that gets between
we have a lot
us
to
and
we have a lot to be ashamed of.
Yeah. Oh, but Robin just says there are Chinese in Australia, but they originate from the gold rushes in the
Yeah, that's right. Yeah,
60s, 70s. Before what they're the reason that white Australia came to with Billy Hughes in the 1900s.
And the bulletin, Australia for the white man was their motto. Yeah.
But it's got more to the point with in Australia until we start to become aware of American culture in the 30s to begin with, but more in the 70s and 80s. The base of Australian culture, cultural cringe again, is Britain. And so as far as we're concerned, Asia and Europe are just inconveniences. If they could sort of delete them from the map and we get to Britain easier, that would be nice.
When the Vietnam War started, the vast bulk of Australians would not have known where the country was.
Yep.
And then when the war ended, and a large number of Vietnamese refugees came and landed in Australia, it completely changed the whole cultural face, the whole culinary and cultural face of Australia.
Yep.
And suddenly we started thinking, well, crikey, there's something out there which is a bit different from us. But up until 75, no, I don't think so. I don't think.
Get on a tram in Melbourne in 1975. It's all white.
All white.
Yeah.
Well, I just want to also mention that I met Jeff Harris, who you mentioned from Adelaide, in 1983 when Cliff Wynn and I won the right to hold the Aussiecon in Seattle, beating out Jeff's Adelaide bid.
I think Jeff Harris basically, and Mark will probably be able to, Mark or Roman will probably be able to tell me better than this, but I think that Jeff was around when I came onto the scene in the early 70s, and I think that he was not involved in the university at all at that time, at least, and he was there, but I don't know how he got into fandom. He may have done so via meeting Alan Bray. I'm not sure.
Alan came in after John Bankson had moved to Adelaide. Came back into fandom. He was actually at Aussiecon.
Yep.
There were a couple of other connections there. For instance, Paul Anderson. Roman, was Paul Anderson OSFA or not?
Yes, Paul Anderson, Jeff Harris, Alan Sandico.
Oh, they were earlier.
We actually did an interview with Jeff and Alan Sandico at the online convention that's sitting up on YouTube. I'll try and find the link. Where they talk about how OSFA got started. But yeah, it started out from the Science Association having a meeting talking about science fiction, and that sort of grew from there.
Yeah, I've got a recording of that. It's going to go on to the second part of the history. It's a good source.
Okay. All right.
Okay.
Anything else?
Don't see
We've
any.
only been going for.
I know we've
two and a half hours. I think we're probably about done.
I think that we are too, and I see no questions in the chat. So, Leigh and Perry, thank you both very much for agreeing to do this and for having such an articulate discussion about Australian fandom. Thanks for coming and joining us.
All right, thank you for having us.
It's been very good.
Bye.
All right. Okay.
Thanks.
Thank you very much, everybody.
Start.